Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me. I have Felix with me today, and we're going to be talking about how a simplistic strategy can help organizations manage their digital transformation. But before I jump into the questions that I have for you, can you give everybody a real quick introduction?
It's really nice to be here, Emma. Thanks very much for the invitation. And I'm excited to talk about digital transformation. I'm a faculty member at Harvard Business School, and I've been thinking about the meaning of digital for a very long time. I remember doing early research on music piracy and what it might mean for the music industry. And I did have some colleagues who asked me, really, like that seems such a minor thing. What is it called? Digitization. And at that point in time, of course, they were exactly right. It affected very few companies, very few industries. And now, as we all know, it's eating companies alive. And so thinking about digital strategy and how best to implement promising digital strategies, I couldn't think of a better subject.
Well, I appreciate you joining me, and you were very modest, but you didn't mention the book that connected the two of us is the book Better, Simpler Strategy. And we're going to talk about some of the ideas from that and how that can potentially inform digital transformations within an organization. So, to get us started, I just want to talk a little bit about the idea of value-based strategy, which you share in detail within the book. Kind of give us an introduction to that idea and then help talk through how that can inform a digital transformation within an organization.
So my work on the book really started with a detailed data analysis. And I was particularly interested in if you're looking at a couple of firms in the same industry at the same period of time, why is it that some companies do so much better than others? And I walked away from that data analysis really being super optimistic about the potential for many, many companies to be far more successful than they are today. You tell me what company you work for, what industry it is, what country, what time period, and in all likelihood, I can show you very similar companies that dramatically outperform your organization. And so when you're thinking about how much runway do I have, I think there's every reason to be optimistic. There's going to be a lot of runway for the vast majority of companies. And then the question, of course, is, well, what do I actually do? And my first expectation was, well, it must be that these leading organizations, that they do something very complicated, that they're very sophisticated about their strategy. And a little bit to my surprise, I found that's actually not true. There are really only three things that these companies do. The first one is they create additional value, extraordinary value for their customers. They create value for the people in their organization, for their employees, or they create value for the suppliers. And done. That's it. There's nothing else. And one reason why I really emphasize this is sometimes we have this impression that you have to be very senior to be a strategic thinker, a lot of experience, gray hair, wrinkles, all the rest of it. And that's not really true. Everybody can be a strategic thinker. And really, what it takes mostly is creativity. Can you think of novel ways how you might increase value to your customers? And by value, I mean very specifically the willingness to pay of customers for your product or your services. Or can you decrease the willingness to sell of employees, meaning how attractive they find the work, the compensation that they absolutely have to have in order to be at your organization? And if the answer is yes, you can think of novel ways and you can move willingness to pay or you can move willingness to sell. You're a strategic thinker. You have a potential strategy.
And so, as we take a look at how technology is, you mentioned this idea of, music streaming and how we maybe thought that wasn't going to be that big of a deal, but now we recognize that disruption is happening all over the place. And technology is shifting what competition looks like. Can you help us understand how companies can navigate some of these dynamics, even if they aren't maybe the Googles or the Amazons of the world? And how does that relate to maybe smaller organizations?
So the first thing in every digital transition is that we're not so sure which technologies matter and which technologies are not so important. I remember this is maybe a decade or so ago, where more than half of American companies said they had teams working on ideas related to blockchain. Today, that number is a small fraction. Why? Well, most companies figured out that blockchain might be an amazing technology. It might allow us to do many things much cheaper, much more secure, in a very different manner. But if they're asking themselves, is blockchain going to change the willingness to pay of my customers, or is blockchain going to change the willingness to sell of my employees? For the vast majority of businesses, it turns out the answer is no. And so that's the first task. Every technology that you see, every opportunity in the digital space, you're going to ask two questions. The first one is, does this technology really allow me to change willingness to pay or to change willingness to sell? If the answer is no, end of conversation. You might have other interesting ways to go through the digital transition, but that particular technology is not for you. And then the second thing that I would like you to think about is, if we do this in a promising manner, what's the selection effect? Who will be particularly attracted to my business if I use a piece of digital technology? And I give you one interesting observation. When you look at the pool of drivers for Uber and Lyft and these ride-hailing companies, you will see that in part they found so many drivers because they have twice as many women who drive as men. How is that possible? Driving a taxi, driving Uber is not that different. Why is it that so many more women are attracted to driving Uber, driving Lyft, driving Via? Well, very simple. We use digital technology to create more safety. And we use digital technology to create greater flexibility. That created a ton of value on the driver's side. And as a result, you get a very different composition of drivers. So two questions really. I see an opportunity, a digital opportunity, and I'm thinking about, does it change willingness to pay? Does it change willingness to sell? And if I can change willingness to sell or willingness to pay, what's the selection effect? Who among my customers will be most excited? Which new customers can I gain? And the same, I think, on the talent side. Who among my employees will really like this idea, and who can I attract in addition to the people who want to work for my organization today? Those are the two big questions to ask. And think of value-based strategy really a filter. If you and I made a list, all the digital opportunities that you have, all the technology that is out there, that list is unmanageable. And the risk is that you do many, many things a little bit, and as a result, don't get much of an effect. Value-based strategy is like a lens. It's like a filter. It allows you to see, where does your company really have the most amazing opportunities.
And I think you brought up, I want to kind of pull on one of the items that you were talking about there with the willingness to sell from increasing safety and infusing technology from like Uber and Lyft's perspective. How else do you think organizations can use this idea of willingness to sell and really focusing in on what their employees are looking for from them as an employer, and maybe change the way that we're bringing technology in to support our employees in this idea of willingness to sell in a different way than maybe we are today?
Okay. So first, I maybe say willingness to sell is not the most intuitive of concepts. When you first hear it and you say, what? We're supposed to lower willingness to sell? That makes no sense. What is this thing about? Here's the thought experiment that I would like you to do. Say you have a friend who works at some other company, and you would like to join that friend your own organization. And so you're writing an offer letter, and you have to state some compensation. And you're thinking about, what's the lowest compensation that I could offer, and my friend would still come? That compensation is the friend's willingness to pay, willingness to sell. And so if the job that you have is super attractive, her willingness to sell will go down because it's a dream job and it's an amazing opportunity. If the job is quite risky, say it's personally dangerous, then her willingness to sell will go up. So we're using willingness to sell as a data-driven measure, very much keeping with the digital times, as a data-driven measure for how attractive is work. If work is very attractive, willingness falls, and if work is to sell goes up. Now, what are opportunities to lower willingness to sell for employees? I give you one example that I like quite a bit. It's in the retail sector. The Gap, the fashion retailer, they ran an experiment and they wanted to improve the life of their workers in any really tangible way. And what I like about this example is typically when I speak with executives and I ask them, how do you make a job a better job? The list of suggestions is quite narrow. It usually focuses on some training or maybe some career aspects, some process-related kinds of things. But the Gap actually had a much bigger insight. If you're a retail worker in the United States, it's actually quite stressful because the typical retail worker knows only about a week in advance when he or she has to work. So you learn very late about what your shifts are going to be. And even worse, the number of shifts that you get vary dramatically from week to week. And as a result, your income varies dramatically from week to week. What did the Gap do? Very simple. They partnered with a company called Shift Messenger, which essentially uses digital technology for employees to trade shifts. My child has fallen ill. I shouldn't really be at work today. Oh, I just offer my shift on Shift Messenger. Or towards the end of the month, I could use some extra income. Maybe I take on some extra work and I'm getting some extra shifts from people who can't really use their shifts. This also allowed the company to take back unneeded shifts. So if and it turns out that, oh, the shipment is not going to come this week, it's only going to come next week. So if too many people, the company can take back shifts on Shift Messengers without any unexpected changes in income. It's a very creative, very interesting use of digital technology. What's the net result? For the first time, employees feel much less stressed about their work. In fact, many of them report that they sleep better because there's more predictability in their lives. They can actually plan their lives. And then from a narrow business perspective, what happens if your employees feel better, if they're more engaged? You guessed it. Productivity shot up. Sales, same-store sales increased by double percentages within the 10 months of this experiment. And so this is the spirit, I think, of using digital technology in a really meaningful way. Always ask, how can I create value for my customers? How can I create value for the people who work for my organization? And then what digital technology is out there in order to help me make that a reality.
I really like that example because I think, I mean, when you hear it, and we had this conversation, having worked in a restaurant for many, many years, I'm like, oh,
yes, you know,
that's a really stressful part of that job. And like, if something comes up, trying to convince somebody to take your shift and all of those types of things, it's a pretty impactful thing for those employees. And it's not that large of a software implementation or shift from the employer perspective, but it has unexpected outcomes for productivity. And so I think that that's a really great example of how you can use this thought process of what is really key to my employees. How do I drive this willingness to sell down, and use technology to do that? And, you know, we talk a lot about within the digital transformation space, how are we increasing the willingness to pay, and how are we making our experience as seamless as possible for our customers? That I think it's really important to think about that flip side and how we're supporting our employees. So I really appreciate that example and a different thought process than maybe just automating repetitive work or the typical types of examples that we hear when we think through that question from an employee side.
And what I like about the way you pointed it out, Emma, is that very often in the digital transition, we have a piece of technology, and then we're asking, what can we do with this piece of technology? And that's, of course, exactly the reverse of what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to think about, how can I add value to customers? How can I add value to employees? And then think about, oh, maybe I'm doing something super old-fashioned that has nothing to do with digital technology, or like in the Gap's case, this would have basically been impossible to pull off if it hadn't been for apps like Shift Messenger. And by the way, there are many of these apps that you could easily use where you create flexibility. But what's really key here is, I think, two things. First, like on the customer side, where we always emphasize customer intimacy is really the prerequisite for seeing additional opportunities to create value. Same thing on the employee side, being familiar. We're thinking about work is from the moment when you're in the store or when you're at your workplace until you leave. But work is so much more. Work is being stuck in the commute and maybe having more flexible hours so that you can come early or you can leave a little earlier. That would be a big benefit. Maybe it has to do with how you have to get through. Who knows exactly all the kinds of things that go into the evaluation. But the trick for successful digital transition is very often to start with opportunities for value creation and then look around what technology is available to pull it off.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and share these ideas with us. And I want to encourage everybody who is not following Felix on LinkedIn, make your way there, make sure you check out the book. And also you make some pretty frequent podcast appearances of your own as well. So hopefully everybody can find lots of ways to follow you and they make their way over to your LinkedIn. But thank you so much for joining me today. And I really appreciated the discussion.
Thank you for having me, Emma. It was a pleasure.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.
If you're looking for expert tips on how to get started with your transformation or looking to hone in on your approach, make sure that you subscribe to our channel to catch our weekly Digital Transformation Talk series, where we interview experts from around the world on how to make it happen.